December 1939. The forests of Kola lie frozen under a pale northern sun, their branches heavy with snow, thick enough to swallow sound itself. Temperatures hover near 40 degrees below zero. The air burns the lungs. Nothing moves except the drifting powder kicked up by a distant artillery thump. On a low ridge overlooking a narrow clearing, a single Finnish soldier lies almost invisible, covered in white, pressed flat against the snow. His breath is controlled, exhaled downward so it will not fog in the sun. The rifle beside him is simple, almost crude, a 7.62mm Finnish M2830 with iron sights, no scope, no modifications, the kind of weapon some of his comrades quietly called outdated or useless in a war filled with modern optics and precision scopes. Across the clearing, a Soviet sniper team scans the tree line for movement. They have been hunting this one man for days. A tiny glint flashes from a lens, just enough. The Finnish soldier shifts a millimeter. One careful squeeze, a single shot. The lens goes dark, and in the quiet that follows, the man they will soon call the White Death adjusts his position, preparing for the next hunt, because the larger story of how he reached this moment is only beginning. In the final months of 1939, Europe stood on a knife's edge. The opening shots of the Second World War had already torn through Poland, drawing clear lines of ambition, fear, and rapidly shifting military power. But far to the north, another conflict was taking shape. One born not from blitzkrieg, but from geography, ideology, and the quiet tension between a small nation and a vast empire. This confrontation would become the Winter War, and within it would rise one of the most improbable marksmen in military history, Simo Häyhä. For the Soviet leadership, the issue appeared simple. The city of Leningrad, an essential industrial and cultural center, sat dangerously close to the Finnish border. The Kremlin feared that any future Western military presence in Finland could threaten the city. Joseph Stalin and his advisors demanded territorial concessions, adjustments of land near the Karelian Isthmus, leasing of naval bases, and the relocation of the border itself. Finland, fiercely protective of its sovereignty after centuries of rule by empires, rejected the demands. Negotiations dissolved into silence. Silence turned to suspicion. Suspicion led to invasion. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive assault along a front line stretching hundreds of kilometers. The Red Army entered the conflict expecting a quick victory. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, tanks by the thousands, aircraft in the hundreds, and infantry divisions that dwarfed Finland's modest mobilization. But this calculated confidence failed to consider the terrain, the climate, and the stubborn determination of a small nation defending its home. The Finnish army, though outmatched in equipment and size, possessed two advantages: intimate knowledge of the landscape and the discipline of citizen soldiers who had grown up hunting, tracking, and surviving in harsh conditions. Many of these men came from rural regions where rifles were a natural extension of the hand, not a foreign instrument of war. Yet even with this hardened experience, Finnish forces faced profound limitations. Their arsenal consisted of a patchwork of aging rifles, limited artillery, and a scarce number of machine guns. Ammunition needed to be conserved. Every shot mattered. Winter clothing was sometimes improvised, and heating for frontline trenches was unreliable. Against them loomed a well-armed, industrialized superpower preparing to punch through the thin defensive lines of the north. Within this landscape, the Kola front emerged as one of the most crucial defensive positions. Located east of Lake Ladoga, Kola was a labyrinth of forests, frozen rivers, and narrow clearings. It was a sniper's battleground, long sightlines broken by dense thickets, endless mounds of snow, and natural blind spots. Here, Soviet forces sought to cut through and encircle Finnish defenders. Instead, they met soldiers who chose to fight with every meter of ground they could hold. Among the Finnish units arriving at Kola were members of the 34th Infantry Regiment, including a quiet, unassuming 34-year-old farmer from Rautjärvi. Häyhä had no interest in fame. He spoke little, followed orders diligently, and carried himself with a calm that his officers found almost unnerving. His equipment was plain. His presence at first was unremarkable. What officers would soon notice, however, was his extraordinary discipline with a rifle. Heiha's weapon of choice was the Finnish M2830, a standard infantry rifle with no optical enhancements. Modern scopes, even when available, were discouraged by some Finnish sharpshooters because the metal fogged easily in extreme cold, and the reflective lens could give away a position. Iron sights offered reliability, simplicity, and, if used by a skilled marksman, astonishing precision. But to many around him, the lack of optics made his rifle seem antiquated. In a war where elite Soviet sniper teams used scopes for long-range engagements, Heiha's unmodified weapon appeared inadequate. Some laughed at his preference, others questioned it directly. Yet he simply continued to train, to observe, and to wait. As the first heavy Soviet assault slammed into Kola, the Finnish defenders realized the scale of the challenge before them. Waves of infantry advanced through snow that reached waist height. Tanks crashed through frozen underbrush. Artillery rained across defensive positions, turning pine forests into worlds of splinter and smoke. For sharpshooters on both sides, the battlefield became a deadly puzzle of angles, shadows, and timing. Each tree became a shield, each patch of open ground, a trap. The Soviets deployed designated marksmen to target machine gun crews, officers, and any Finnish sniper who posed a threat. The duels began almost immediately, and quietly, almost anonymously at first. Simo Heiha began to appear in daily reports. A Soviet sniper eliminated near a ridge, another near a frozen marsh, 3 more along a tree line at dawn. There was no drama to his actions, no theatrics, only clean, precise shots that contributed to holding a fragile line under impossible pressure. These early successes set the stage for what would soon become legendary. Because as the weather worsened and Soviet attacks intensified, the front at Kola would transform into a crucible, one that revealed not only how Finland fought, but how one man with a supposedly useless rifle would come to dominate a battlefield filled with trained killers. And with the front tightening and the Soviet advance growing more desperate, the deeper context behind this sniper war begins to come into focus. The Kola front was unlike most battlegrounds of the Second World War. It was a place shaped as much by nature as by strategy. Dense forests formed walls of dark timber that towered above the snowfields. Frozen rivers cut lines through the terrain like brittle glass. Visibility could expand to hundreds of meters across open white plains, or collapse to a few meters when blizzards swept in without warning. In these shifting conditions, even the smallest movement could determine life or death. When Soviet forces pushed deeper into the region in December 1939, they expected Finland's defenses to break quickly. Instead, they found themselves entangled in a geographic labyrinth that punished every misstep. Heavy Red Army equipment bogged down in snowdrifts. Vehicles stalled in temperatures far below freezing. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets on certain days. The Finnish defenders moved lightly, efficiently, and with a deep familiarity with the land. They skied silently through forest paths and positioned themselves with natural camouflage honed from years of hunting. But the Soviets brought something Finland could not match in quantity: snipers. Many had been trained in dedicated Soviet shooting schools built during the 1930s, programs designed to produce marksmen for both battlefield accuracy and psychological intimidation. Armed with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles, these shooters were deployed in teams. Their task was to eliminate Finnish officers, machine gun crews, and any sharpshooters interfering with the advance. Their presence increased dramatically as the Winter War entered its second month. And as Soviet snipers began targeting Finnish positions around Kola, a pattern emerged, one that both intrigued and alarmed their commanders. Soviet sharpshooters were disappearing, sometimes one per day, sometimes several. The cause was almost always a single, clean shot delivered with uncanny consistency. To understand how one man could dominate these duels, it is essential to examine the tools and methods he relied upon. The Finnish M2830 rifle, derided by some for lacking modern optics, was an evolution of the Mosin Nagant design. Manufactured with excellent barrel quality and extremely tight tolerances, it offered impressive accuracy in capable hands. Finnish doctrine emphasized reliability over complexity. A rifle that worked flawlessly in the snow, that did not fog, freeze, or reflect sunlight, was more valuable than a sophisticated tool that could fail at critical moments. This is why Simo Heiha preferred iron sights. In temperatures approaching 40 degrees, metal contracts, lubricants thicken, and optical lenses become liabilities. Even a breath of warm air could frost a scope instantly. Iron sights, by contrast, never fogged and allowed faster target acquisition in the stark white landscape. The rifle's shorter sight radius demanded mastery, but for someone who had practiced since childhood, its limitations became strengths. Still, among Finnish ranks, the debate persisted. Many believed that without a scope, a sniper's effective range was too limited. Some questioned whether Heiha could keep pace with the growing presence of Soviet marksmen at Kola, but those who fought beside him began to notice something. He always positioned himself carefully. He always fired only when he was certain, and he rarely, if ever, missed. The environment itself became part of his arsenal, the deep, cold, hardened snow into a stable firing surface. Sunlight reflected off the white landscape, providing natural illumination without glare through iron sights. Shadows stood out more sharply. A trained eye could catch the slightest unnatural shape, the tilt of a scope, the dark smudge of a face mask. A breath that rose too visibly. Soviet snipers, operating in teams, often shifted positions aggressively. They moved to flanking angles. They tested Finnish lines repeatedly. But, in this frozen forest, movement was a dangerous necessity. Even a single misplaced step could create a sound that traveled across the still air. Heiha listened for it. He waited for it. He built firing nests into snowbanks, packed the snow in front of his muzzle to prevent telltale bursts of powder smoke, and kept a mouthful of snow to reduce the warmth of his breath. Nothing revealed him. By late January, his presence at Kola had grown beyond rumor. Officers began assigning him independent sniper missions. Soviet commanders began issuing warnings about an invisible shooter in the region. The duels became more deliberate, more intense. Finnish soldiers saw more enemy bodies marked by precise shots delivered from unknown angles. And as Soviet sniper teams increased their efforts to counter him, Heiha responded not with new equipment or tactical innovation, but with the same quiet discipline he had always relied upon. His rifle remained unchanged, his approach stayed simple, but his effect on the battlefield grew each week. What none of the soldiers around him yet knew was that the most intense period of sniper combat was approaching, a stretch of days that would test every skill he possessed and would push the reputation of this quiet farmer from Finland into the realm of legend. Long before the Winter War, long before snipers hunted one another across the frozen forests of Kola, a quiet rural life shaped the man who would become its most feared defender. Born into a farming family near the Finnish-Karelian border, he grew up in a landscape where survival demanded precision. Winters were harsh, summers were filled with labor. Hunting was not recreation. It was a contribution to the household. A rifle was not a symbol of war, but a practical tool used to put food on the table and to measure one's patience, awareness, and respect for nature. His neighbors knew him as disciplined, methodical, and humble. He spoke rarely and smiled often, a combination that made him easy to underestimate. But those who trained with him in the Civil Guard shooting clubs understood the truth. He had an extraordinary ability to focus on small details. He practiced relentlessly, treating each shot as a test of character rather than a display of skill. By the time he entered military service, his foundation was already set. The Winter War did not create a great marksman. It merely placed him in a context where his lifelong habits became deadly advantages. His calm under pressure, his ability to remain motionless for hours, and his instinctive understanding of terrain were all qualities born from daily life, not military instruction. This human foundation explains why he trusted his own judgment so fully, why confidence, not arrogance, guided every decision he made at Kola, and why the simplicity of his chosen rifle suited him so well. These traits formed the first layer of a sniper who would soon transform the battlefield. Among Finnish troops, debates over rifles were common. Some soldiers prized the latest optical sights. Others preferred modified Mosin Naggins, or foreign-made weapons. And then there was his M2830, plain, unscoped, standard issue. To many, it looked outdated the moment he stepped onto the line. Soldiers teased him lightly, calling the weapon old-fashioned. Some viewed it as a disadvantage in long-range duels. Others were puzzled by his refusal to accept a scope even when offered. But to him, the rifle was not inadequate. It was familiar. It was reliable. It behaved in the cold exactly as he expected. And he demanded consistency above all else. Optical sights in 30 degrees temperatures posed problems that frontline troops learned quickly. Fogging was constant. Glare from snow betrayed positions. The metal contracting in extreme cold affected zero stability. In contrast, iron sights were immune to frost, quicker to align, and required no adjustments. The barrel quality of the M2830 was exceptional, its tolerances extremely tight. In practiced hands, it could deliver hits with astonishing accuracy out to distances where most soldiers hesitated to fire. What outsiders mocked, he trusted. What others considered a limitation, he turned into an extension of himself. The rifle's simplicity complemented his method. No unnecessary movements, no unnecessary risks, no equipment that could fail at the wrong moment. Modern armies often associate lethality with technological sophistication. His story demonstrated the inverse. The weapon mattered, but mastery mattered more. This technological angle reveals a truth that the coming battles would prove decisively. The rifle was not useless. In fact, in the freezing labyrinth of Kola, it became the perfect tool for a marksman who demanded absolute control. The Winter War was fought not only against a human enemy, but against one of the harshest climates on Earth. Temperatures plunged low enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. Snowfall buried trenches overnight. The environment shaped strategy, movement, and survival. And for him, the cold was not an obstacle. It was an ally. He understood winter intimately. He knew how snow absorbed sound, how shadows stretched longer across the white plains, how frost formed on cloth and metal. He selected positions with the awareness of a hunter. He carved small depressions in the snow, creating natural firing nests that blended seamlessly into the terrain. He packed snow in front of his muzzle to suppress blast signatures. He even kept snow in his mouth to prevent warm breath from rising visibly in the air. Soviet snipers, many unfamiliar with such extreme conditions, struggled. Their scopes fogged the moment warm air met cold metal. Their heavy uniforms slowed movement. The simple act of shifting positions left trails or disturbances in the snow, signs he could detect from remarkable distances. Environment shaped every duel at Kola. The cold punished haste, rewarded patience, and amplified the skill differences between marksmen. In this frozen battleground, his familiarity with winter transformed the landscape into a silent partner, one that concealed his presence and exposed the enemy's vulnerabilities. Through this environmental angle, the battlefield becomes clearer. The snow itself was part of his arsenal, setting the stage for the shifting human, tactical, and psychological dimensions that would soon intensify. The Red Army entered the Winter War with a doctrine that placed great value on snipers. Throughout the 1930s, the Soviet Union invested heavily in marksmanship training. Shooting clubs, military courses, and political organizations encouraged proficiency with rifles. By 1939, Soviet sniper schools were producing significant numbers of trained sharpshooters, many equipped with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles designed specifically for long-range engagements. Their mission at Kola was simple: eliminate Finnish defenders who slowed the offensive, especially machine gun crews and officers. But as Soviet units pushed deeper into the region, a new priority quietly emerged, neutralizing the mysterious Finnish sniper responsible for a rising count of dead Soviet marksmen. Reports filtered up through command chains describing an invisible shooter who did not use a scope, who fired from positions undetected, who left no traces. This shooter was described variously as a ghost, a demon, a phantom of the snow. Soviet commanders knew this was not superstition. It was a tactical threat capable of crippling their advance. Teams were dispatched with explicit orders to hunt him. Some snipers were given additional spotters, others were instructed to bait him into revealing his position. A few were promised commendations if they succeeded. Almost all failed. Their tactics, aggressive movement, reliance on optics, predictable angles, played against them in a landscape they did not fully understand. The forest rewarded silence, patience, and subtlety, qualities he mastered long before the war began. Each Soviet attempt to outmaneuver him reinforced a growing frustration. Their best marksmen disappeared, sometimes within hours of deployment. The enemy angle reveals that this was not merely a duel of individuals, but a clash of doctrines, cultures, and assumptions about what defined a superior sniper. Counter-sniping is not glamorous. It is slow, methodical, and defined by discipline rather than aggression. A sniper must locate a shooter who is also searching for him, and who often fires first. In this deadly symmetry, mistakes are fatal. He approached this challenge with a philosophy grounded not in bold maneuvers, but in uncompromising restraint. His positions were chosen with meticulous care. He evaluated cover, sightlines, and escape routes with the precision of a craftsman. He avoided high points that offered visibility but exposed the shooter. Instead, he preferred low angles that blended into the terrain. Once positioned, he remained still for hours, often lying completely motionless even as snow settled across his back. He did not fire unless the shot was certain. Missing was unacceptable, not for ego, but because it risked revealing his presence. His understanding of enemy behavior was equally refined. Soviet snipers often exposed themselves by relying too heavily on their optics. The glint of a scope, a slight movement of a rifle barrel, or the dark outline of a fur hat against the snow were visual cues he exploited relentlessly. He also anticipated Soviet firing rhythms, learning how they shifted positions, how spotters communicated, and how teams attempted to flank Finnish defenses. This tactical discipline created an asymmetry. Soviet teams reacted. He anticipated. They hunted with aggression. He hunted with patience. The battlefield became a chessboard, and he refused to make the first impulsive move. Through this tactical lens, the extent of his advantage becomes unmistakable. He was not simply shooting faster or straighter, he was thinking further ahead. As weeks passed, the psychological impact of his presence became as powerful as his marksmanship. Soldiers on both sides of the front began speaking his nickname in hushed tones, the White Death. The name was not invented by Finnish propaganda at first. It emerged from Soviet troops who witnessed comrades fall without warning. They believed he could be anywhere, see everything, and strike without being seen. Fear reshaped behavior. Soviet soldiers became reluctant to raise their heads above trenches. Units moved with hesitation across open snowfields. Some snipers refused to deploy in certain sectors of the Kola front, convinced that entering those woods meant certain death. The psychological strain compounded the already brutal conditions of the Winter War. Within Finnish ranks, the effect was different but equally strong. He represented possibility, a reminder that even the strongest power could be resisted through discipline and determination. Finnish defenders used rumors about him to boost morale. When Soviet troops hesitated, Finnish units exploited the delay. His reputation became a force multiplier far greater than the impact of any individual rifle shot. Importantly, the man himself did not seek this legend. He never embellished his actions, never boasted, never attempted to build a myth. His humility made the growing stories around him feel even larger. Soldiers spoke of him as if he were an embodiment of the landscape itself, cold, silent, and unyielding. Through this psychological angle, it becomes clear that by the time he entered the most intense period of his service, he was no longer just a sniper. He had become a symbol, and symbols carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. By early March 1940, the Winter War was entering its most desperate phase. The Red Army, frustrated by months of heavy losses and international embarrassment, intensified efforts along the Kola front. Their objective was no longer merely to break Finnish lines, it was to crush them outright before diplomatic pressure or internal strain forced an end to the campaign. Artillery barrages grew heavier. Infantry assaults became more frequent. And through it all, one priority sharpened within Soviet sniper teams: eliminate the Finnish marksman who had turned Kola into a killing ground. They knew exactly which sector he favored. They had studied his patterns, or what they thought were patterns. But patterns were an illusion. He rarely used the same position twice. He rotated locations constantly, moved at unpredictable intervals, and used terrain features that Soviet marksmen misread. His skill was not only accuracy, it was invisibility. In the final week of February and the first days of March, Soviet commanders escalated their counter-sniper operations. They deployed more teams, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time, each equipped with scopes, camouflage, and spotters. Their intention was to create overlapping fields of observation, to bait him into firing so they could triangulate his location. It was a method that worked against most snipers, but against him, it only provided more targets. The stretch of forest where he operated became a battlefield within a battlefield. Finnish soldiers later described the area as a silent zone, where movement ceased, voices dropped, and even the wind seemed to pause. The pressure was immense. Soviet forces believed they could break the stalemate by removing him from the equation. Finnish defenders knew that every sniper eliminated by him delayed a Soviet assault that could overwhelm their thinning lines. Then came the 4 days that would define his legacy. It began with a Soviet sniper team establishing an elevated position overlooking a narrow frozen clearing. They believed the vantage point gave them superiority. It also exposed them to sunlight that reflected off their optics. He noticed the glint almost immediately. Taking position at the base of a snow-covered rise, he waited. He measured the wind, barely moving. He studied the angle, the sun behind him, the Soviet shooters backlit. At a range considered extreme for iron sights, he fired once. The spotter fell first. The sniper shifted instinctively, revealing more of his silhouette, and the second shot dropped him. The duel ended before it truly began. Later that afternoon, another Soviet sniper attempted to flank the Finnish line from a different angle. His rifle barrel protruded slightly from behind a spruce trunk, a mistake caught by trained eyes. One precise round ended him. By dusk, 3 enemy snipers had fallen. The Soviets entered the next morning with renewed determination. They adapted, moving in smaller increments, avoiding exposed positions, and attempting to force him into revealing himself through suppressive fire. They also deployed snipers in pairs further apart, believing dispersion would dilute his ability to track them. It did not. He eliminated 5 more that day. Each shot methodical, each target chosen with care. Finnish observers reported hearing single cracks of a rifle followed by extended silence. No bursts, no hurried follow-ups. Only certainty. Cold winds swept across Kola that night. Finnish troops huddled in trenches. Soviet soldiers whispered about the White Death with unease. Their fear was grounded not in rumor, but in loss. Their best marksmen were being systematically removed. On the 3rd day, Soviet commanders escalated once more. They deployed some of their most experienced snipers, soldiers with years of training, men confident in their ability to outthink their opponent. They split firing zones into smaller sectors, hoping that their expertise would reveal his hiding place. But the terrain favored him. He had spent weeks studying every undulation of the land, every tree trunk thick enough to hide behind, every depression deep enough to disappear into. By contrast, Soviet marksmen entered unfamiliar spaces each day. 7 more fell before nightfall. Some died while scanning for movement. Others perished attempting to reposition. A few never fired a single shot. By the 4th day, Soviet forces were running out of options. Commanders committed an unusually large number of sniper teams to a single sector, granting them full freedom to engage at will. Finnish scouts spotted at least a dozen enemy sharpshooters maneuvering into place. It was the most dangerous day of his service. And yet it was also the most devastating for the enemy. He eliminated 18 in a single day. Some engagements lasted minutes. Others ended with barely detectable signs of enemy presence. The duel became almost ritualistic. A faint movement, the smallest disturbance in the snow, the slight shift of a rifle barrel, and then a single shot, delivered without hesitation. By the time night cloaked the battlefield again, Soviet attempts to remove him had collapsed. 33 snipers had been killed across 4 days. The Soviet sniper organization around Kola was effectively shattered. The line held. But the climax was not yet complete. The pressure from the Soviet advance continued. Artillery increased. Counter-sniper operations intensified. And within days, an event would occur that nearly ended his life and marked the final turning point in his wartime service. The 4 days of relentless duels had transformed the Kola sector into a shattered arena of shattered branches, cratered snow, and eerie silence. Soviet commanders were stunned by the scale of their losses. Their sniper corps, one of the most respected in the Red Army, had been peeled apart by a single man without a scope, a soldier armed with nothing more than iron sights and an unwavering sense of purpose. Their response was not retreat, but escalation. They believed he had to be stopped at any cost. In the first days of March 1940, Soviet operations along the Kola front grew increasingly chaotic. Infantry assaults surged forward, supported by heavy artillery bombardments that shook the ground so violently that snow cascaded from tree limbs like miniature avalanches. Mortars rained across Finnish positions. Machine guns hammered into defensive lines. The battlefield became a turbulent blend of fire, smoke, and blinding white snow. Behind this fury, the Soviets pursued their remaining objective: eliminate the Finnish sniper who had cost them so dearly. New sniper teams were brought forward, not raw recruits, but hardened veterans. These were shooters from units elsewhere on the front, dispatched specifically for the task of breaking the stalemate. Some had experience from the Soviet-Japanese conflicts in the Far East. Others were senior marksmen trusted by their commanders to restore balance to the front. But the environment had changed. The Soviet sniper corps at Kola was no longer confident. Every step into the forest felt like stepping into an unseen trap. Every reflective surface was a risk. Every silence was threatening. And while their fear grew, he remained the same: calm, deliberate, and relentlessly precise. As Soviet operations intensified, he continued to move through the forest with the same discipline he had maintained since December. His camouflage suit blended seamlessly with the snow. He dug firing nests at dawn, repositioned at midday, and relied on natural concealment rather than structures that could be spotted by enemy optics. A typical mission lasted long hours, sometimes 12, sometimes more. He would lie motionless, feeling the cold seep through layers of cloth, controlling his breath until it felt almost imperceptible. When Soviet units advanced, he did not panic. When artillery landed nearby, he did not flinch. His actions were defined not by reaction, but by consistency. Finnish officers later described him as the embodiment of stillness. Through this period, his kill count continued to rise. But it was clear to both sides that the tension was building towards something more decisive. And that moment arrived on March 6, 1940. The morning began like many before it: dull gray light, drifting snow, distant artillery rumbling through the trees. He positioned himself near a shallow depression overlooking a wooded slope. Soviet snipers had been active in this region the previous day. If they returned, he intended to meet them. He spotted movement mid-morning, a figure shifting between trees at medium distance. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. He prepared to fire. Then, in the same instant, another flash caught his eye. A second sniper. He had walked into a coordinated Soviet attempt. Before he could react, a violent crack split the air. The impact struck his face, sharp, sudden, overwhelming. The round tore into his lower jaw and cheek. Explosive ammunition, outlawed by international conventions, but sometimes used on the Eastern Front, caused catastrophic injuries. The side of his face was destroyed instantly. Bone shattered, flesh torn. He dropped where he stood, unconscious before he hit the snow. Finnish soldiers nearby saw him fall. At first they believed he had been killed. His face was so badly damaged that they struggled to identify him. Only when one soldier recognized his rifle did they realize the wounded man was their most effective sniper. The news spread through the ranks like a sudden shockwave. The White Death has been hit. Medics carried him away from the battlefield, blood freezing on his clothing as he was rushed toward a field hospital. The wound was so severe that surgeons announced he was unlikely to survive. His jaw was nearly obliterated, his cheek shattered, the left side of his face collapsed inward. They placed him in critical care and prepared for the worst. Hours later, as night fell across Kola, the Soviets continued their bombardment. But they did not know the truth. They had succeeded in stopping him, but only temporarily. On March 13th, just 1 week after he was wounded, the Winter War came to an abrupt end with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. The timing was almost surreal. Had he survived his injury for only 7 more days, he would never have returned to frontline combat again. At the moment the ceasefire came into effect, he lay unconscious in a field hospital, his face unrecognizable, his future uncertain. But the damage done to the Soviet sniper corps at Kola was permanent. 33 of their sharpshooters had fallen in 4 days. unlocked dozens more across the Winter War. One man had stalled an entire tactical campaign, not through myth or propaganda, but through cold discipline and unmatched precision. The climax of his wartime service ended with both triumph and tragedy, a turning point defined by extraordinary results and a devastating wound. And yet, the true consequences of his actions, military, political, and human, were only beginning to unfold. When the Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, 7 days after he was shot, he was still unconscious. Surgeons had little hope. The explosive bullet had nearly torn off the entire left side of his face. Jaw, cheek, teeth, and part of the sinus cavity were destroyed. The initial medical notes described him as barely alive, yet against all expectations, he did not die. On March 14th, the day after the ceasefire took effect, he regained consciousness. His first sensation was pain, a deep, consuming ache radiating through what remained of his jaw. His first thought was confusion. His second was fear. At the moment he woke, he did not know who had won the war. A nurse told him the fighting was over. His reaction was characteristic. He nodded, remained silent, and closed his eyes again. Even in devastating condition, he didn't speak unless necessary. Communication came later through notes and gestures. Speech was impossible. Not long after he awoke fully, they showed him a mirror. He later said, "I didn't recognize myself." His face was grotesquely swollen. The left side sagged inward, bone absent beneath the skin. Teeth were missing. He could not open his mouth more than a few millimeters. Eating, drinking, and breathing were difficult. He required feeding tubes at times. Other times he swallowed liquids with great difficulty. And yet, even then, his morale never collapsed. Friends and nurses recalled that he remained calm, quiet, and disciplined, much as he had been on the battlefield. Finland had few specialists capable of reconstructive maxillofacial surgery in 1940, but they did everything they could. His treatment unfolded in phases. Stopping the bleeding had been the first major challenge. The explosive bullet had left fragments that were not easily removed. Infection was a constant danger. Surgeons cleaned the wound repeatedly, draining it and preventing sepsis, a near miracle given the conditions at the time. The left side of his lower jaw was essentially gone. Surgeons reconstructed it using bone grafts, stretching skin flaps to restore a functional mouth and cheek. His face would never be the same, but they gave him a usable jawline. He lost many teeth. Some were replaced with dentures, others rebuilt. Chewing solid food again took nearly 2 years. He practiced opening and closing his jaw with small movements, millimeters at first, then more. Speech returned gradually. It remained slightly slurred for life, but he regained enough clarity to speak normally in conversation. This long medical process lasted years. But the most critical phase, the one that determined whether he would live, was those first few months. Sometime in early summer 1940, he received a visitor, the Finnish commander who had famously said, "Kola kestää," Kola holds, a phrase that had become a national symbol. The commander looked at him for a moment with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Few soldiers had sacrificed as much. The commander later recalled, "He lay there, wounded beyond recognition, but his eyes were the same, calm and steady." Finland was shocked by his injury. Newspapers published descriptions of the wound, sometimes exaggerating its severity, but the truth required no embellishment. He was awarded the Cross of Kola, created specifically to honor defenders of that sector, the Medal of Liberty, first and second class, for bravery. Promotion to second lieutenant by the commander-in-chief himself. In Finland at the time, battlefield promotions from private to officer were exceedingly rare. His was one of the most dramatic leaps in rank in Finnish military history. He received the promotion while he was still recovering, unable to speak, barely able to swallow, but alive. During his months in recovery, foreign newspapers began reporting on the mysterious Finnish sniper who fought with iron sights and survived an explosive round to the face. American, British, and Swedish journalists wrote articles about his extraordinary kill count, his humility, his wound, and his unexpected survival. They called him by a new name, White Death, a title that spread far beyond Finland's borders, becoming part of wartime folklore. For the first time, he realized that the world now knew him, but he did not seek fame, and he did not enjoy attention. When asked later how he felt about the nickname, he answered, "I did what I was told, as well as I could." By the end of 1940, he could walk, eat soft food, and speak short sentences. His family saw him for the first time since the injury. They were shocked by how unrecognizable he was, but he reassured them with a simple sentence written on paper: "I'm alive, that's enough." While he would carry the wound for the rest of his life, the man beneath it remained unchanged, reserved, disciplined, and quietly strong. His future, however, would take a direction nobody expected. When he finally left the hospital months later, the war-torn Finnish countryside was beginning to thaw. Spring sunlight melted the last layers of winter snow, revealing fields that had once been battle lines. For him, the landscape looked familiar, yet the world he returned to felt fundamentally changed. He did not go back to the front. His injuries made service impossible. Instead, he received farmland through a government program supporting war veterans. The land was modest, but to him, it represented independence and the chance to build something with his hands, something the war had not touched. He threw himself into this work, mending fences, raising cattle, growing crops through short northern summers, rebuilding his strength with the steady rhythm of farm labor. Neighbors later recalled that he worked harder than men who had never been wounded at all. The routine gave him clarity, and the solitude was familiar, much like the forests of Kola. The fields offered silence, and he thrived in it. Throughout the early 1940s and into the decades that followed, journalists and historians attempted to interview him. Many expected a dramatic warrior, a man eager to recount battles or boast about numbers. Instead, they found someone uninterested in fame. He never bragged. He rarely gave details. Most reporters left with only a few notes, usually containing some variation of his typical answer. "I was doing my duty." When reminded of the staggering number attributed to him, over 500 confirmed kills, he simply shook his head. He said he never kept count and doubted anyone else could know the exact number, given the chaos of the front. He wasn't being modest, he was being honest. Even after multiple surgeries, the left side of his face remained visibly altered. The cheek was tight. The jawline was irregular. One side of his mouth did not fully raise when he smiled, but children in his village were not afraid of him. Adults were not uncomfortable around him. People said that after a few minutes of conversation, they stopped noticing the injury altogether. His steady, calm demeanor seemed to override physical appearance. He was never bitter about the wound. When asked once if he regretted fighting with an iron-sighted rifle instead of a scoped one, he answered, "A scope might have saved my face, but it also might have gotten me killed." Scopes reflected light. Iron sights did not. To him, it was a simple calculation. Though he avoided attention, honors continued to come. Veterans groups invited him as a guest of honor. Foreign newspapers published retrospectives on the Winter War. Military historians studied his shooting methods, analyzing how he compensated for recoil, breath control, and winter distortion. He attended a few events, but only out of respect for other veterans. He never stayed long, yet those who met him often said the same thing. He carried no hatred, no anger, no hero complex, only a quiet dignity, as if he still lived by the rules of the forest. Stay calm, stay still, and speak only when necessary. As he aged, he continued living on his farm. He remained active well into his 70s, chopping wood and tending animals despite lingering pain. He also enjoyed hunting, though far less intensely than during the war. He preferred small game, usually fired only when necessary, and avoided unnecessary killing. For him, hunting was not sport. It was a connection to nature, a continuation of the discipline that had kept him alive in the forests of Kola. In 2001, he moved into a veteran's home where he spent his final years. Staff members described him as polite, quiet, and occasionally amused when younger soldiers asked him for advice. He rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, it was never about glory or numbers, only about the men who fought beside him. By the time he passed away in April 2002 at the age of 96, his story had grown into legend. Military analysts around the world study his marksmanship, his ability to remain unseen, his discipline in extreme cold, his psychological steadiness, his refusal to use a scope, which modern snipers still debate. Some consider him the most effective sniper in recorded history. Given the short duration of his combat, Only about 100 days of active fighting. Others focus on the human side, a farmer who fought because he had to, who returned home without theatrics, and who lived humbly despite worldwide attention. The final image. Those who visited him in his final years described one consistent scene. Out the window of his room, he would often sit quietly, drinking coffee, gazing toward the tree line beyond the facility grounds. Tall pines, snow in winter, wind moving gently through the branches. It resembled Kola in a way. Perhaps memories lingered there, or perhaps the forest simply felt like home, unchanged by fame or history. What is certain is that his life, once defined by 4 months of brutal combat, ultimately became defined by the decades of peace that followed, decades he earned shot by shot, breath by controlled breath, in the frozen silence of a war that should never have reached his homeland. And with the consequences of the war fully explored, only one final question remains.